This is block 5, we're on 20, section 3, to change in society, the section beginning with wets and dries. Another big conflict in the United States in the 1920s and 19-teens that preceded it. Another urban versus rural conflict. We just talked about, religious fundamentalism versus modernism with the Scopes Monkey trial. Another big dividing issue between urban America and rural America was their views on prohibition. If you remember, there had been temperance movements in the United States all the way back from the 1830s. And now you get these terms. These are terms that you should know. If you were in favor of prohibition, you wanted alcohol to be banned, you were a dry. That makes sense. Alcohol is wet. You don't like alcohol, you're dry. So it is saying this county is dry meant that alcohol was illegal in a particular county. People who opposed prohibition and supported alcohol were known as wets. So the wets versus the dries. In general, rural Americans tended to be dry. Now, this was not hard and fast, but most of the political support from prohibition came from your more rural-minded states. States out west, states in the south. Your wets tended to be populated by those same kind of modern-feeling people who like to, engage in the fun and dancing and jazz of the modern world. Your immigrant groups, especially your Germans, your Irish, your Italians, tended to be wets also. But, as we can tell, prohibition did become law during the Progressive Age, as we saw. It was the prohibition was passed, the 19th Amendment, the 18th Amendment, outlawed the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol in the entire United States. And you can see here's a pro-prohibition poster. Help me to help keep him pure. Please vote against the sale of liquors. Prohibition is also very largely associated with women's movements and women in general, that anti-alcohol was supposed to keep little babies pure. It was supposed to make sure their husbands came home with the money and didn't blow it at saloons on their way home from work. So the amendment was passed that the United States was not going to have, or was not going to allow the manufacture, sale, or transport of any intoxicating liquors. And then they passed a law known as the Volstead Act to enforce it. The Volstead Act kind of made the constitutional amendments specific. These were the specific laws about what could and could not be produced, what exceptions there were. There were religious exemptions, for example. You could still use wine in a Catholic Mass, for example. What the penalties were. So the Volstead Act enforces prohibition. And you can see from the picture that, here's a barrel of alcohol being dumped down the sewer. This happened all over the United States. And this was a big conflict between urban and rural America also. Most of urban America, whether it was the modern elements of urban America or the working class immigrant groups of working America, did not like prohibition. And it was your more conservative rural types that were in favor of banning alcohol. This law has to rank up there with one of the most unsuccessful laws in the history of the American Republic. It was violated constantly, everywhere, always. Alcohol was still produced in the United States. What we have here is we have a moonshiner and a moonshine still. Down especially in the backwoods of Appalachia and the like, sort of out of the reach of local law enforcement, people still made alcohol. And then it became even more violent in the sense that once something is made illegal, but people still want it, it is going to be produced. You all know perfectly well that crack cocaine is illegal, and you also know perfectly well that if you want crack cocaine, you can go get crack cocaine. And the same thing applied with alcohol. If you wanted alcohol, you knew exactly where to get it. And the saloons went underground. They became known as speakeasies. and anyone who knew where to go could go into a speakeasy and enjoy alcohol just as much as everybody else. But because it's illegal, organized crime gets involved. This is Al Capone, probably the most famous of all American gangsters, that organized crime now takes on it starts to run the alcohol industry. It produces it, it ships it, it transports it, it pays off the cops not to, raid the speakeasies. The cops knew exactly where the speakeasies were, but the gangsters would make sure that the cops had an extra 20, 30, 50 bucks a week, so they would kind of keep their noses away. Anytime you have organized crime, you're going to have and organized crime, this is when there had always been ethnic, gang-related crime in the United States. That if you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, you know that every single ethnic group had its own enforcers and protection people. But now that there is this multi-billion-dollar industry that is illegal, organized crime jumps in with both feet. And people like Al Capone and his associates became incredibly rich throughout the 1920s. But they were also, let's try hard, and we have this interesting little cultural thing in the United States. We romanticize gangsters, whether it's the Godfather movies or the Sopranos television show or Goodfellas. We romanticize these guys, and it's an interesting aspect of American culture. But Al Capone was a vicious killer, and he had no bones about killing anyone who stood in his way. The most famous example of this gang violence, this mob violence that hit the United States, was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was where Al Capone kind of killed off, or tried to kill off, his rivals in Chicago. Capone was based in Chicago, kind of in the middle of the country, and he pretty much ran Chicago, and he controlled a wide empire of illegal alcohol, gambling, prostitution, drugs, all the good vices of people. It was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, actually, that heralded the end of people like Al Capone, or of Al Capone particularly, not of organized crime, but of Al Capone, that it was so bloody and so violent. These people were kind of captured, lined up against a wall in Chicago, and executed with machine guns. It was not a pretty picture when the police arrived, later on that day and found these people. And it caused, one of the results of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was that it caused the federal government to get involved. And the federal government kind of invented its own investigative bureau, and it called it the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We today call it the FBI. And the FBI was largely brought into existence and given prominence to fight the gangsters who were providing all the alcohol that people wanted during Prohibition. The FBI had limited success, and they had limited success because while people were happy and able to pay for booze, somebody was going to provide. Prohibition is finally repealed in the early 1930s. It is the only amendment to be repealed by another amendment. But the Volstead Act and Prohibition, another conflict between urban America and rural America, which spawns a whole underground culture of speakeasies and jazz and drinking and hiding from the cops, is all a consequence of that attempt to engineer society, to socially engineer, to improve society by making things illegal. And its consequences were violence and crime and people like Al Capone, and just in general, a disrespect for the law. If you don't respect the law, you're unlikely to follow it. And many, many, many millions of Americans had no respect for the Volstead Act and Prohibition.